Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 4 of Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, Duel at Araluen. Let's go ahead and get into it. Maddie was dreaming. She dreamed she was in the marketplace in Castle Redmont's courtyard. Canvas stalls had been set up, selling items of clothing, knives, axes, saddles, and bridles, and bolts of freshly dyed cloth. But she was heading for her favorite place in the market, the row of stalls where food was sold. And in particular, she was heading for the pie stall. She checked her pockets, making sure she had a couple of silver coins. She'd only need one for the savory pie she had in mind, and she'd insist on paying. All too often, stall-keepers would hand over her purchase and try to wave away her offered payment. No charge for a ranger, they'd say, grinning. But Will had taught her to always pay her way. We don't accept free food or goods. That way, we don't owe anyone anything. When she'd queried this, he'd continued, "Imagine that one day you find one of these traders sneaking food or wine from the castle's larder cellars, or you find them smuggling goods upriver. So you arrest them, and they look at you and say, 'But you always accepted the free pies I gave you.' You'll be beholden to them, and that will make it harder to do the job you're supposed to do." Reluctantly, she agreed he was right. It was better for a ranger to be unencumbered by any sort of debt or obligation. It was why they lived apart from the castle, in their cozy little cabin among the trees. Rangers had to be seen to be impartial, to be influenced by nobody, from the Baron himself to the lowliest pie vendor. The savory aroma of the pies was stronger in her nostrils now, and her stomach rumbled with anticipation. She took one of the coins out of her jerkin pocket and increased her pace. A heavy-set man, heading in the opposite direction, barged into her, jolting her shoulder. Not expecting the contact, she dropped the coin. As she stooped to retrieve it, the man buffeted her shoulder again, staggering her. Then he did it again. "Cut it out," she said angrily, but he continued to buffet her, shoving her on the shoulder with increasing force. Then, amazingly, he leaned closer to her and blew his warm breath in her face. She recoiled. His breath wasn't exactly scented like roses. In fact, it smelled strangely of grass and oats. She opened her eyes and found herself staring into Bumper's long face, a few inches from her own. "Get out of it! What are you doing?" she slurred at him, only half awake. Dimly, she realized that, true to his name, her horse had been shoving her shoulder with his head. There was no heavy-set man. Even worse, there was no pie stall. Just her horse, and the thick grass where she had been dozing. "By Blarney's perpetual beard, when you sleep, you really sleep, don't you? I've been trying to wake you for 10 minutes. I thought you were dead for a moment." Like all ranger horses, Bumper was prone to hyperbole. The bumping and breathing could have been going on for more than 30 seconds. Maddie sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What do you know about Blarney, or his beard?" she said irritably. Blarney was a minor Hibernian deity Halt had told her about. His beard grew constantly down to his feet, no matter how often he cut it or shaved it. Each night it would regenerate at full length. As a result, he was constantly tripping over it. It made him a very bad-tempered minor deity. Bumper leaned back away from her and tilted his head knowingly. "I hear things. I know things. But for the moment, I thought you'd like to know that there's a ship heading this way." Instantly, she came fully awake. "What? Why didn't you say so?" She tried to scramble to her feet, but caught her left boot in the hem of her cloak, tripped, and sprawled on the grass. Bumper sniggered. "You and Blarney are quite a match, aren't you? So agile, so sure-footed." "So be quiet," she told him, getting to her feet more carefully and retrieving her bow and quiver from where they had been lying beside her. Bumper's shoulders shook as he continued to snigger, but silently now. She shielded her eyes with one hand and peered downstream. Sure enough, there was the pale triangle of Heron's sail several hundred meters away. The little ship was cutting through the water at a fast pace, driven by the brisk wind on her right-hand side. She frowned. Right side wasn't how sailors described it. They had a technical term for it. Stuffboard, she said to herself, pulling up her cowl. Bumper sniggered again, audibly this time. Stuffboard? Stuffboard. That's what sailors call the right-hand side of their ship, she told him, a superior tone in her voice. He shook his ears at her. I think the term you are looking for is starboard. She gave in, realizing she could never top him in this sort of discussion. Instead, she began to walk down to the river's edge. He ambled cheerfully behind her. Who made you such an expert? She muttered. But of course, he heard her. As I said, I hear things. I know things. You're a know-all and a blowhard, she told him. He looked mildly pained. A blowhard? She nodded, turning to face him. A blowhard. And believe me, I know. I just had your oaty, grassy breath in my face, and it wasn't any fun. For once, it seemed he had no reply. He leaned his head back and stared indignantly down his long nose at her. Then he shook his ears and mane again. Pleased with their little victory, Maddie hurried down to the river's edge. The ship was only 100 meters away now. Hoping they had a sharp-eyed lookout on duty, she took a white scarf from inside her jerkin, held it above her head, and waved it back and forth. Perched on the bow-post lookout, Jesper saw the sudden movement on the bank of the river. He was a little disconcerted that he hadn't noticed the person standing there until the white cloth began waving. Whoever it was, they were clad in a green and brown mottled cloak that made them blend into the woodland background. Belatedly, he called a warning to Hal. Someone's waving at us, on that grassy bank ahead. At the steering platform, Hal, Jern, and Thorn had been discussing plans for the repair work on Wolfbiter. At Jesper's hail, they swung their attention to the bank. What's that he's wearing? Jern asked. Hal narrowed his eyes. Like Jesper, he found the figure quite difficult to make out, but he'd seen cloaks like that before. That's a ranger, he said. Jern frowned. Makes him hard to see, he commented. Hal glanced at him. That's the general idea. Heron was heading straight toward the bank, so there was no need to turn her. Hal called to Ulf and Wolf. Ease the sail a little. The speed dropped away as they complied. He's not very big, is he? Jern said. Now they were closer, he could see the figure a little more clearly. A lot of them aren't, Hal said, but don't make him angry. Rangers are incredible warriors. Thorn had been silent while he scrutinized the slight figure on the bank. Now he spoke thoughtfully. You know, I don't think that's a man at all. It's a girl. In a ranger cloak? Hal said, surprised. He'd never heard of such a thing. He looked more carefully. You could be right. Then the ranger pushed back the cowl of the cloak, and he saw her face more clearly. It's Cassandra's daughter, he said. Maddie. What's she doing with the ranger cloak? Thorn smiled to himself. I knew there was something unusual about her. Even as he had been studying the figure on the bank, Hal had unconsciously been measuring angles, distance, and speed. He called to the twins now. Down sail! And the sail slid easily down the mast, where the sail handlers gathered it in and roughly folded it. Heron skimmed on over the rapidly shallowing water, and he swung the prow slightly so she would run onto the sand at an angle. You're going to stop? Jern asked. For a slip of a girl? Hal glanced back at him for a second, then went back to judging the Heron's approach to the bank. That slip of a girl, as you call her, is a ranger," he said, "and she's the daughter of the Princess Regent. I think it might be wise to see what's on her mind." The bow grated onto the sand, sliding up a few meters. Then, as the way dropped off her, the hull swung parallel to the bank. Instantly, Jesper was over the bow, running a few meters to set the bow anchor firmly into the sand. Maddie nodded to him as he passed her, then walked toward the grounded bow of the little wolf ship. The two crews crowded the sides, watching her curiously. Stig went forward and leaned over the gunwale, offering her a hand. She gripped his wrist, and he heaved her effortlessly up and inboard, setting her on the deck beside him. "Welcome aboard," he said, grinning. She smiled in return. "I'm glad to see you. I was afraid I might have missed you." She glanced around the ring of curious, bearded faces, and frowned. "There weren't this many of you before, were there?" "We picked up some of Wolfbiter's crew," Stig told her. The little ship's deck was crowded. Maddie estimated that there must be nearly 30 men on board. She smiled inwardly. 30 Scandians would make a powerful attack force, she thought, if her mother's estimate of their fighting ability was accurate. She looked around. The press of bearded, muscular sailors obscured her view. She barely came up to shoulder height on most of them. "Where's Hal? Your skirl?" she asked, remembering the Scandian term for a ship's captain. Stig gestured toward the stern. "He's back this way." He waved an arm at the crowding seamen gathering around this strange apparition. Some of them had encountered rangers before, but none had seen a female ranger. "Make way, you lot! We're coming through." The grinning sea-wolves parted to let her and Stig through, and she followed the tall first mate back to the stern, where Hal and Thorn were waiting, along with a third man she didn't recognize, another of Wolfbiter's crew, she surmised. Hal stepped forward as they approached. "Welcome, Princess Madeline," he said. True to Scandian form, he made no attempt to bow. "Is that the right term for you?" She certainly wasn't dressed like a princess, he saw. Beneath the cloak, she had a quiver of 24 arrows on her belt, balanced by a double scabbard holding a sax and a smaller throwing knife. Her bow was slung over one shoulder. "Just Maddie will do fine," she said. "I only do the princess thing at Castle Araluen. The rest of the time, I'm a ranger, fourth-year apprentice." Hal noticed the bronze oak leaf around her neck. It was a ranger's symbol, he knew. Jern frowned at her announcement. "But you're a girl." There was a question obvious in the statement. Maddie nodded agreement. She had heard that dozens of times before. She was used to it by now. "Nice of you to notice. As a matter of fact, I'm the first female ranger, the first girl to be selected as an apprentice in the Corps." Thorn shook his head, a huge smile on his face. "I knew there was something about you," he said. "That boar you shot. That was no fluke, was it?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips briefly. "No," she said. "I sort of knew what I was doing. I thought you'd seen through my act." Thorn smacked his wooden hook into his left palm. "I knew it," he said. "I told these others. There's more to her than meets the eye." "He did," Hal confirmed. "He said it several times." "More than several," Stig put in, grinning. In fact, he became a little tedious on the subject. "The fact is," Thorn said, "I knew it, and none of the rest of you did, no matter how many times I told you." "Which was a lot," Stig said, but nothing could wipe the satisfied look from Thorn's bearded face. Sensing he was about to say, "I knew it," again, Hal held up a hand to stop him. "So, Ranger Maddie, what can we do for you?" All right, that's going to bring us to the end of Chapter 4. Thank you for listening. God bless, and have a good one.